Welcome to Zealots at the Gate, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm Matthew Kaming.
I'm Shadi Hamid.
Together we research politics, religion, and the future of democracy at Fuller Seminary's Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life.
We are writing a book together. This podcast represents an informal space where we can talk about how to live with deep difference. Thanks so much for joining us.
Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen, and please leave us a review. And feel free to connect with us at zealots@comment.org. Now, over to Shadi.
Yeah, so Matt and I are good friends, but that said, maybe we shouldn't be. Because Matt's Christian, I'm Muslim, Matt's conservative, I'm liberal, I guess. Matt's white, I'm brown-ish. Matt studies theology. I'm a political scientist by training, and we don't usually get along, those two sides. Matt's from the rural Northwest, and I'm from the urban Northeast. So our identity markers are somewhat divergent, but here we are, and we like talking about deep difference.
Shadi, we should talk also about how you are part of the elite, while I am part of the people.
Oh, yeah, you're a common man.
Yeah, that's
I've heard about you guys. So yes, I am unfortunately a member of the elite, and I live in an elite enclave in D.C. I am also, in this case, outnumbered by two Christians. So we have a very special treat for all of you today. We have a guest. We have James Wood, who's with us right now. He's an assistant professor of ministry and theology at Redeemer University. He's also ordained as a pastor, and he has become really a rising star on, no, it's true, a rising star on the right side of the spectrum when it comes to, sorry, maybe I shouldn't say that. I actually don't know how to describe you. Let me just.
Cut that out. Please don't.
Okay, so let me continue. Sorry about that. So James is actually, he's become one of my favorite theologians to follow. He's an excellent writer, and we'll include some of his recent pieces in the show notes. And he's really become prominent for some of his controversial, sometimes even combative takes. But here we're gonna unpack all that and go deep on a question that is dear to Matt and I, which is the question of political doubt and how certain we should be about our political commitments. And actually, our previous episode, as you, our dear listeners, will know, was actually the case against political certainty and the dangers of not introducing doubt into our thought when it comes to both politics and religion. And James has written, I think, quite eloquently about the dangers or the risks of being too winsome when discussing religion and politics with people you disagree with. And, we don't have to get into the whole winsomeness debate, but maybe, James, could you start us off by laying out how you've come to rethink your own winsomeness and how you converse with people who disagree with you?
Yeah, and I'll start it by saying the issue is not being too winsome, but the particular, I think, perils and proclivities of those who adopt that framework that I've observed, both in myself and in some of the people who would appropriate the label for themselves, who have a prominent platform. I think some of these things can be analyzed and are exhibited often. But I guess the way I've summarized winsomeness, and then we can get into what my thoughts are about it, is it's been a kind of a posture towards cultural engagement that was became prominent, I think, probably in the last 20 years, articulated by a great American pastor and public theologian named Tim Keller up in Manhattan, New York, who's had a very successful and fruitful ministry, and whom I very much still admire, even though people might not assume that. I try to convey that in my writings, even as I try to make a qualified critique of this. But the way I've summarized kind of what it translates into is, well, before it translates into how I would summarize it, is it's trying to maximize gospel openness by minimizing offense. And then where it trickles out into political engagement is, I think, oftentimes being a little bit more nuanced and careful and charitable towards positions from kind of the left side of the spectrum that would typically be representative of maybe secular coastal elites, and then punching a little bit harder, being a little bit less nuanced and charitable towards positions on the right. And I think there's interesting. I try not to do I try to resist bulverisms at all costs, and so I try not to analyze motives. I think you could, but if you notice in my writings, I actually try to very much avoid that. And so I just try to look at tendencies, and so that's what I see. And I noticed in my own heart. So I mentioned my first things piece where I talked about this. I really started to notice this in the 2016 election. I didn't vote for Trump either time, but I noticed that I had a certain hardness towards those who did, and I wanted to investigate, interrogate that. What was that? Even if I disagreed with them, what did I want to? Was there something wrong in my thinking, and how did I end up there? So I don't blame Tim Keller or other people for that. It's how I appropriate the model. But I also, over the years, had started to notice similar things among people who would say that they appropriate the Winsome model, that they had similar tendencies. But I also, so what I've also said, or how I kind of came to this place, maybe two interesting angles in, is actually by becoming more familiar with the political activism and thought of people on the left. And it's one of the reasons why and not because I radically disagreed with them, but because I agreed with them. They convinced me on certain things. So two figures, two figures. One was in my, I'm trying to see which one would be better to begin with. One was just in my research, in my doctoral studies on French Catholic thought in the 20th century. And I studied and wrote on a figure named Honor de Lubac. We don't need to go into that unless we're interested later. But I came across one of his really close friends who was more to the left of him, Emmanuel Meunier. And he helped articulate kind of the fundamental principles of personalism, and then kind of trying to translate into that to a political movement in many ways. But he critiqued Christian Democrats in France of his day, which you could say are kind of like a third way, because my critique of third wayism goes with this. But he critiqued kind of the third way approach to politics and cultural engagement in his day, and he called that movement paraplegics of virtue. And he felt like some of these ways of thinking inhibited their ability to act prudentially in the political order. And so when I was reading, I was like, gosh, that's something, I'm challenged by it. I'm challenged by that thought. Second, my in-laws, and they'd be glad to share this. They've been registered Democrats for their entire life, and they're strongly involved in political activism and promotion of the Democratic platform. But we're very, very close. My father-in-law is an Episcopal priest and a theologian of sorts, and we're extremely close. But I just noticed that, throughout our whole relationship, he was very willing to share with me his political opinions and did not care if I agreed with them or if it would ruffle my feathers. And I presume that he trusted that we could get through it. We could actually work through it, and we have. We're very, very close. But eventually I started to think, like, why does he feel that freedom and I don't? And is there something wrong? And I don't think it's a vice. I didn't view his approach as a vice. And so that made me start to revisit some, and I've actually shared with him some of my, because he's so unfamiliar with it. He's not an evangelical. He doesn't know Tim Keller and all those things. And I shared with him some of these critiques that I've had. He's like, about, approaching politics this way of through the Winsome model. And he's like that. He just laughs at it. He thinks it's silly. He's like, who does that? And he's like,
what's his argument for why it's silly?
Well, and so this is actually working through this has helped us actually move closer to each other, even in the disagreement. He's like, politics is about justice. Like, I think you're wrong on justice issues. And like, so we need to work that out. And I'm like, actually, that's been really helpful for me because I think you're wrong on justice issues. And but like now we're operating with a similar terminology, and it actually has enabled us to disagree really, really well. And so he's like, I'm okay with ruffle your feathers. That's okay because these are big causes we should be pursuing, and we should be able to get past the niceties and the decorum a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't mean divided. Yeah.
Yeah, James, and if I can just jump in there, I think that right there is exactly what I've really come to appreciate about your work. I've been reading through a number of your articles. I listened to one of your lectures just this last week. We'll share some of those in the show notes. for those who are interested. But in many ways, you might say I'm a bit of a target of what you've been talking about. So I was an intern for Tim Keller within his church in New York.
Yeah.
I was a student of Richard Mao, who's written a lot about political civility. I've talked about political hospitality. I've even used the rhetorical devices of a third way, critiquing right-wing nationalism and left-wing multiculturalism. So, like, in so many ways, I was the target of, at least I felt like the target of that initial piece. And so naturally, my initial reaction to your piece was not positive. But as I continued to dig into this, I grew in my affection for the things that you were talking about, even while I don't think I would ever articulate myself the way that you have here. And we'll talk a little bit later about our differences. And I'm pretty sure Shadi's going to try and pick a little fight between us. But I think you're exactly right that many Christians in America who try to be nice politically fundamentally don't understand what politics is, in that it is a contest over different visions of justice and the good. And so fighting is actually like a sort of joyful debate is actually what politics is all about. And trying to avoid that really just kind of, it gets you into a destructive pattern of what you might just call passive-aggressive politics, in which you're nice, but in sort of underhanded, sort of cynical ways, you make nods towards the people that you disagree with, but you don't directly engage their ideas. And that's, I think if I had to name something that I really appreciate about your effort here this year, is that you're saying, no, we need to directly contest one another. And that is part of what it means to love your neighbor.
That's good. And so, I don't even know what I'll pick. There's so many good things that I would want to tease out. But like the frustrating thing about the third way thing is I still agree with it to a degree. And I've mentioned that in multiple pieces. Almost every time I talk about it, there's an aspect of it that I agree with. Is like, as a Christian, you can't have an uncritical association with any contemporary party, and we shouldn't be trying to divide our churches along political partisan lines. I absolutely agree with that. But I think where I get wary on it becomes a little bit too much of like a hegemonic framework of where you even apply it to particular debates over particular issues, and you try to do a both sides on every one of the issues.
Can you give us a practical example of this?
Yeah. So
how third way works for those who may not be familiar. Let's take like abortion or something. Walk us through how a third wayer would do that.
Yeah, okay. And that is the key one, and I mentioned that in the first things piece. Though I love Keller, I think he had some missteps there. And unfortunately, when he had that infamous Twitter thread on abortion, it came right before Dobbs released, and I think it was unfortunate timing for him. But okay, let's start with this. So the third way thing it can be summarized often with the little trope, neither left nor right? And that's why it does connect up with Christian democratic movements in the 20th century, because that actually was a pretty common axiom for Christian democratic movements. And the American Solidarity Party would be a type of third way party. And so anyway, but getting away from parties, how it applies often to just like discourse over issues is like you come to the abortion issue. And a third wayer often will be like, well, okay, so abortion, we think it's wrong. And yet neither party has a proper approach to this. It doesn't capture all the aspects even that we'd want to use to address this. And so, the left is wrong. Democrats are wrong on this because they want abortion. Not only we've moved well beyond safe, legal, and rare to shout your abortion up to 9 months, whatever, codify Roe nationally is a major plank right now of Biden's administration. And so, that they're wrong there. But then the other side, they'd say, okay, but the other side doesn't get it either because they don't really care about the poor. And we need to be thinking about like a whole life perspective. And the reason people have abortion is because, we don't have enough government funding and so it's economic reasons. And so
that sounds reasonable.
And so it sounds reasonable. I'm not convinced that's actually explains most abortions. I think that often a little bit is a red herring, and I also don't think that conservatives are calloused towards some of those issues. They might have other solutions. And so, for instance, like I would say, I would still be a conservative on some of the answers to those things. Is like, how are we going to support the family? Why is the family not being promoted? And how are liberal policies and platforms undermining the family? And so one of the reasons these women are in these situations is because we're not doing actually enough fundamental conservative work on that issue. So anyway, and so you kind of speak out of both sides of your mouth, being like, well, we can't really be confident that like the conservative answer here is the good one. And so you kind of I think oftentimes then it undercuts practical, practical solutions in the interim. You know, until the eschaton, we're not going to have any perfect program, but what can we do now? Well, we can.
So you would basically like these moderate Christians, these third wayers, these people to pick a side and fight for it. You know, right or like even if it's imperfect, just kind of pick a side and fight.
It doesn't mean pick a side meaning partisan. I mean, I'm talking even about particular issues. Yeah. Like, so just pick a side and articulate it confidently, boldly, and you don't have to speak out of both sides. You get into all these false moral equivalencies where you kind of like give equal airtime to the flaws in all of the options. And I think that undercuts the good that you can pursue. So I summarize one of the reasons why I think the winsome third way frame gets into bad, silly territory is I think it has a fundamental wrong view of politics. Politics is not kind of maximizing openness for the gospel. It's about the prudential pursuit of justice. And so the prudential part's important for me. I'm not a utopian. I'm not a millenarian, but I want to help people think practically, prudentially, and with the right ends in mind.
Okay, so if we could just zoom out to some of the bigger conceptual issues here, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, James, but in some of your early writing, compared to some of the more recent things that you've written, I do notice, and it's not a bad thing, I just think it's worth interrogating what's going on. There is more certainty and confidence in your writing. It's bold. It is combative, and combative shouldn't be seen as a pejorative word because sometimes democracy requires peaceful intellectual combat between competing conceptions of the good. These are not minor issues. These go to the very heart of what makes us different and why we disagree on fundamental questions regarding religion, the state, and so forth. But you did give a speech, which I read in full, to the National Conservatism Conference, and that was more of speaking to an audience that is already going to be predisposed to your views. Yeah. And it was more of like a rallying call. You were just there and you were going to arouse the masses out of their slumber. And I'm wondering, do you think there is a risk of too much confidence and too much certainty that if you decide to be the happy warrior in some of these contested debates, that there's a risk of losing the doubt that can temper certainty?
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add to that a little bit in that, like I said, I thought you made a really wonderful point about the dangers of trying to be winsome and the dangers of trying to build connections and bridges that can, if you make that your goal, that can shape and form you in bad ways. And I have no problem with that. But related to what Shadi's talking about, isn't there also a formative danger in being the happy warrior where you're out there to fight? Like, isn't engaging in political battle also, endangering you in sort of being shaped by the medium?
Well, that's an interesting, different question. And yeah, and I'm very, one of the reasons why I've felt, I'll kind of wax theological about it a little bit, is maybe in God's providence, it made sense for me to jump into some of this, is my grounding in, for instance, like de Lubach's work and kind of relativizing politics. Because I still relativize politics in my own thinking. I've only kind of jumped into this conversation because it's kind of been thrust upon me. To be honest, just one little side note is I really had no idea that that first article would do all of this. I mean, I've written more provocative pieces even before that. I mean, I wrote on wokeness when it was still kind of unsafe to write on wokeness, and at public discourse and places, and critical theory before, that was a little bit less safe. And so, but I think a lot of these kind of conversations that I've taken upon have been like, I'm having conversations inside back channels and things like that. And people seem to be really concerned and confused. And I felt like, okay, I have something that has proven to be a little bit helpful in helping them think through these things. Is it worth putting into publication? And so, but yeah, then that piece blew up, and now I guess I'm the anti-winsome crusader. But I hope to move on from that, and go back to other things. But okay, so the danger. So I mentioned the Delubach thing is I really care about the danger of putting politics at first in your mindset, and I very much want to help Christians not only think clearly about politics but de-absolutize it, and to ground. My dissertation is on Henri de Lubach's view of the church as sacrament and how that reframes a political imagination to primarily locate your social life and identity in the church. And so I do want to resist the absolutizing. And for instance, like Rashadi and I have agreed in previous conversations, is I absolutely believe, and I've challenged my friends on the right, of like, look, you have to accept election results, for instance. Like that's one way of de-absolutizing your attempt to win. Like you have to be able to lose as well. Like I want to help Christians not be pietistic and therefore like undercut the actual pursuit of winning. But I don't want them to not be willing to lose. And so we have to be willing to lose. And I agree with that.
It seems to me your push to those who are trying to be winsome in political spaces, those who are trying to build bridges, your push on them is it can direct them in ways they ought not go. And I'm asking you to reflect on the opposite danger of joyfully engaging in the battle might end up directing us in ways that we might not go as well. So I take your push, from my side of the aisle, but I ask it back to you about, isn't there engaging in Twitter battling and Twitter mockery and Twitter, back and forth, does that not also take us places we should not go as Christians?
Yeah.
And as citizens, we could just say more broadly.
Yeah. So, there's a lot. And then Shadi's point was about certainty too. So I don't want to forget about that. Yeah, and so that's one of the reasons I mentioned I locked up my Twitter account, because that's part of actually an ascesis of sorts, to pull back a little bit in my own life, because I don't want it to consume me. And I stayed on and got a lot more active once the pieces were first coming out and people were responding to the ideas, and realizing that I want to pull back a little bit more than previously. And so I recognized that temptation, and I'm actively trying to think about what my role is. And I also recognize different callings as well. Not everybody, what I'm promoting in some of this stuff is not that everybody needs to engage at the same level. But some people are, like if some people have training and gifts, like, Christian theology of the gifts is that they're not to terminate upon yourself, but to be used for the blessing of others. And so if there's something there that you can contribute to the current state of discourse, I think you have there's a sense of calling to that. And so some of this I've felt, but I'm not promoting that everybody engage in the same way. And the mockery question is interesting, because I actually don't engage in much mockery, and I'm actually pretty reticent about it. My friend Brendan Case has written a great little essay on Pascal and his kind of apologetic for the place of mockery in Christian.
And I bring up that word mockery because you did discuss it in one of the lectures that I jumped into, and actually you made a qualified argument that Christians should engage in public mockery of their opponents. And that really caught my attention, because I had never considered that to be an option for a Christian citizen to engage in mockery. And so, I'm not just going to let you kind of get away with that. So, go ahead, James.
Well,
why should Christians engage in mockery? Go.
Well, do you, Well, okay, so maybe I'll start with this: is it's better than engaging in physical violence. That's one thing.
Well, okay.
And but that also is actually part of Brendan's argument in his essay, which I'd encourage your audience to go read. And he gives 6 rules inspired by Pascal, Blaise Pascal, who made a defense for the use of mockery in Christian discourse. And he kind of gave some guidelines of here, if you're going to do it, here's how you should do it. Here's some guardrails. But one of the things, particularly I appreciate the last 2 that Brendan refers to is, first of all, he says like mockery obviously should not be your default, your go-to, and it's not mine. I think it's actually pretty hard to do well. But I've been learning, I'm thinking a lot about it. Is there a place? But he also, in the last 2, he said you should only mock people who are unreasonable and powerful. And so you punch up, not down. And I think politically that's actually pretty. There's a whole precedent about that, about the use of satire to puncture through oppressive hegemonies, and to also be a relief valve for the people who feel like they're suffering without recourse, and to also expose folly. So you're trying to expose. You're ridiculing to expose the ridiculous, and especially when it's imposing upon you in an oppressive way. And that is a way, and if you could convince your opponents through that use, because they're being unreasonable, that is a way to sidestep a proclivity to quickly go to physical violence if you feel like that's your own. So it is another outlet, and so I think there's a place for it. But I if you follow me on Twitter, I don't really use it very often. I'll use pretty direct arguments because I think it's really hard, and I think it's really hard to not go after, first of all, one of his other arguments is you primarily go after ideas and not persons. And I think people who traffic in mockery regularly, they go quickly to ad hominem things. And I think that's a real danger. And so you have to avoid that. But I think there's absolutely a place to ridicule the ridiculous who are powerful.
Yeah. Shadi, what do you think about that? Mockery. Do you mock people and ideas on Twitter? Why or why not? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so to be quite honest, I haven't thought about it a lot myself, especially the particular word mockery. I do use sarcasm. I can be dismissive towards opponents. Is that mockery? Am I sort of, in a way, poking fun at their silliness without them even realizing, maybe, if they don't understand what I'm really saying? I mean, I think part of the issue is that the time that we live in is different, and it raises, I think, a broader question of whether exceptional times call for unusual. So we could say that mockery is best avoided, but if we live in a time where people are truly ridiculous in a way they haven't been previously, then maybe that does push us to be a little bit harder edged. And I say that because I think that part of how evangelical Christianity, how it's evolved, at least as it seems to me as an outsider who's not Christian, is that there has been a desire to be harder edged, to be rough sometimes in the political combat that we're talking about. But I think that's a result of a conclusion that Christianity in some sense is under attack by the secular status quo, that something has changed over the past 10 years where, and I think, James, you make this argument in one of your pieces, that there was a neutral era where Christianity was seen as odd, but there wasn't really any effort to demonize people who chose that way for themselves, where you say that post-2014, it has shifted. If we talk about those who are culturally dominant in our mainstream institutions, there is now an effort to delegitimize and even sometimes demonize what are standard small o orthodox Christian positions. So it seems to me that a lot of your approach, James, is premised on that starting point. It does hinge on whether you think something fundamental has changed in our public discourse where Christians are now on the defensive and they have to fight for their survival, for the survival of the faith in some really basic sense, and for the survival and flourishing of Christian ideas. And that requires a different kind of combat. So mockery then, at least as I can see justifications for mockery if that is in fact the situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and this would be my push on. I'd have a number of pushes on you here, James, but I guess I would say the opposite, that mockery is not called for because our culture is too hard or too antagonistic. I think of jokes and levity as being appropriate in places where there are high levels of trust and mutual understanding. And so with dear friends, I will mock and make fun of them because they know I love them and I'm connected with them. But if it's from someone far away that I'd like to convince, mockery, I don't see how that helps me or an embattled Christian church in a contested environment. So I find levity to be best placed amongst, relationships of trust rather than antagonism.
But Matt, if the goal, but just to sort of defend James a little bit here.
You told me to fight with James.
No, this is great. Perfect. So I think that if the goal is to expose ridiculousness, and mockery is a means to that particular end of shining a light on something that is but shouldn't be, if that is the goal and it gets you there, then what's so bad about that? Like, isn't that a reasonable goal, to expose something as fraudulent or as dangerous or ridiculous?
And I think that's one of the things I would add to that is with the whole, it's unfortunate that I have to spend a lot of energy on the three worlds schema. But, I included it in my first things article because it was familiar to our audience. And there's something that I do resonate with about it, but I don't over-rely on it in my own thinking. I've thought a lot about post-Christendom for a long time, even in previous publications. And I think what Ren is doing is putting us some kind of like graspable terms on some shifts at a particular stage of post-Christendom. And so, but where Ren and I would agree is I'm not primarily talking about like, oh, it's so hard for Christians and like we need to grab back power for our own interests. I'm still talking about justice, and I'm talking about like what's good for society and like, not just for us. And I'll get to that in a minute, like maybe some examples of that. But I'm also talking about like how the broad public has shifted away from Christian moral norms to shape the public order, and also, or even moral norms shaped by conceptions of natural law, for instance. So it's not just about like a Christian position of privilege. That's not entirely unrelated, and like, oh, it's going to be hard for me. I have something related to that. It's more about like, okay, how is the public order really turned away? And I think Obergefell really was an accelerator. Because that now Christians can't really avoid those conflicts. I mean, it does kind of encroach into a lot of things, and the Christian view, the traditional Christian view, I know there are certain Christians who will disagree, is antithetical to the new ruling order on sexuality and marriage and things like that, and it's viewed as backwards. And to go back to that is it's now some sort of it's anti-progress and it's opposed to human flourishing and all that. So, but I also am. But I'm one last comment, and I'm trying to help Christians prepare not to hate the culture, but to prepare to brace for some pushback that they're probably not used to. And I think the winsome model often doesn't do enough to prepare them for that. It doesn't mean you'd be a jerk in the light of that. So I'm not saying mockery all the time, but I'm trying to help strengthen fortitude of like, okay, when pushback comes, that you're not ill prepared for it. I actually think if you're better prepared for it, you can be less defensive and less hostile. If you actually think about it ahead of time, it actually enables civil discourse, I believe.
Yeah, Shadi, I want to pivot it to you and to Muslim responses to this negative world or whatever that you see here in America. How are Muslims responding to this shift that we're seeing within the American left. And do you see them going towards being combative, towards being quiet, towards going along with it, towards engaging in mocking of these sort of far left movements? What sort of parallels or distinctions do you see in this? I mean, as you listen to these two Christians talk about these things, where does your head go as far as American Muslims?
Yeah, well, first of all, I enjoy listening to Christians so much, so I'm really I'm really enjoying this. But when it comes to the American Muslim community, I think we are at a fascinating point. Something is changing. I had written some things about like grumbling within the Muslim community that American Muslims had so closely aligned themselves with progressives and the Democratic Party, and that inevitably this was going to create tensions when it came to moral and religious issues. But the thing is, if you look at the people who are like the Muslims who are dominant in the public debate, who have the largest platforms, they tend to be younger and progressive. So in some sense, they're not representative of the broader conservative current within American Islam, which is, in some ways, it's like an elite mass distinction. Elites who are hyper educated tend to be more progressive on some of these social questions. And, I even find it odd that I sort of have to play the role of expressing what conservative Muslims might think, even though I don't really self-define that way. But there is, and I've started to use this term because I think it is what we're seeing, that the elephant in the room, around this time of the midterms, and by the time you, dear listeners, listen to this, it will be after. So, democracy may have ended by then. But I have talked about a brown backlash. The Democratic Party is hemorrhaging people of color, Hispanics, certainly, black men to a lesser degree, Arabs, Muslims, and it is all coming to a head. It's been building and building, and now I think we're actually seeing what this looks like. And both of you might have heard at least bits about the Dearborn Revolt. I don't want to exaggerate its importance by calling it a revolt, but it was about books that were in the public school system or a library. It is a little bit complicated, the details, but certainly there were a couple offending books that had to do with, let's say, rethinking gender identity at a fairly young age. And I think a lot of that that is what's brought this out. I think for a lot of people, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. I feel weird using that proverb in reference to Arabs and Dearborn, but yeah, I think a lot of people said, well, the wokeness, we don't really get that. The racial identifiers where if you're brown, that means you have to have a certain position and that you're no longer primarily an individual with his or her own thoughts. You represent a disadvantaged minority. That was anathema to a lot of children of immigrants. That's just not how we were raised to think about our country and the evil of the founding and white privilege and atoning for sin. A lot of this was foreign to us. It's not really, but then I think a lot of people said, okay, on some of the debates around gender identity and public education, this is where we have to draw the line. So I think we're seeing right now in real time what that actually looks like. And you are seeing a more combative element emerging from, parts of the American Muslim community. And I think some of the logic is the same, that this is existential. This is no longer an abstract debate about secularism or the lack thereof. This is a debate about our kids, our families, our communities. And I think that just sharpens people's focus. And that's why I think Democrats made a very big mistake in intruding upon such sacred ground. Like, that's just something you don't do. You don't mess with that, especially with socially conservative groups. Hispanics, if you actually poll them on various social issues, they are more conservative than your average white liberal. So, that's gonna play a role. So I don't know. Like, I don't know what all this will mean in the end, but I do see a combative element emerging. That said, I certainly don't feel under attack as a Muslim in America. I think something good has changed in that we've become more normalized in the political debate. We don't have Republican politicians who are engaging in your kind of perpetual anti-Muslim baiting, which was a huge issue in 2015 and 2016. We were the calling card of the Republican nominee. Like, the Muslim ban wasn't just a side issue. It was at the center of his campaign. But the good news is that Trump doesn't really talk about Muslims anymore. It's almost like he forgot about us. I'll take it. And I think part of the reason is that wokes, whatever you want to call the woke folks, they've become public enemy number one from the standpoint of the GOP, and that it's taken off some of the preoccupation with Muslims and the threat of Sharia and so forth. I mean, there's a lot there, obviously, but Matt, like, how does that sound to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really very fascinating. James and I come from, white conservative Christian backgrounds. And so our tribe has found itself, sort of belonging to one political party. And so we're always wrestling with how do we either belong or distance ourselves or correct ourselves or whatever else. But the Islamic community in America is interesting in that it was pretty divided politically in the 1990s. You had a good amount of Democratic Muslims and a good amount of Republican Muslims. And then it goes through the, post 9/11, you have many Muslims moving to the Democratic Party. And now I hear you describing a shift again of some Muslims leaving the Democratic Party for the Republican Party. So I see Muslims experiencing a lot more political movement and estrangement over the last 30 years in America, whereas sort of conservative Christians or evangelical Christians have sort of been sitting, within the Republican Party ever since Jimmy Carter. And that creates a lot of problems for us as well. And so, I mean, there's some interesting connections, but also just very differences within the story. I don't know, James, what do you think when you hear Shadi go through that story there about wokeness and the way in which it's sort of shaking loose some Muslims from within that Democratic community?
Yeah, I would advise also listeners, if they haven't heard it, Joe Rigney gave a great talk he's probably one of my favorite talks at NatCon, and kind of added to this conversation that's relevant to Shadi's point is one of the major shifts he sees in recent years is where he resituates kind of Ren's framework is focusing in on like natural law or the Tao, like kind of appealing to like C.S. Lewis's abolition of man. And where a major shift he understands is kind of a complete rejection of some of those fundamental conceptions that in many ways evangelical Christians were a vanguard of in America. But how might that, okay, so if primarily like the left moves away from, for instance, like the what is a woman question, like, we're getting into some territory of like really questioning basic realities. And how does that affect religious minority communities as well? How might that change some of their political affiliations? I'm interested to watch that. And is there some new co-belligerencies that emerge from this? And how might that be beneficial? I mean, I'm not a doomer. I think there's reasons to be hopeful if that happens. I mean, how could that be positive for Muslim-Christian relations in America? And might there be reasons for hope there? So, yeah, when I look at some of the shifts, it's not all negative. Some of it there could be some reasons for glimmers of hope in the midst of this. And so the things that Shadi's sharing, if there's kind of a reawakening of kind of social traditionalism that creates some new types of co-belligerencies among previously groups that were previously more fundamentally at odds, it's reason for be hopeful.
Yeah, and I think that we can get to this in a moment if we want to talk more about the Islamic context. But one thing I wrote in my First Things essay, and we can include a link to that in the show notes, which James was actually the editor of when he was at First Things. So we had some interesting. I think we both liked the argument, and it turned out really well. but I think that there is something odd about Muslims have had a long experience and experimentation with what we might call post-liberalism. And I would even say that Muslims in the Middle East and beyond were at the vanguard of, first of all, seeing the fundamental weaknesses of liberalism, and then thinking about what alternatives to liberalism might actually look like. I mean, obviously the context is different because when we talk about Islamic post-liberalism, we're talking about an approach that is going to inevitably be more legalistic because the role of Islamic law in the kind of Islamic imagination, there obviously is no equivalent to that in the Christian imagination. So when Christians do post-liberalism, they don't really have a strong anchor in clear legal alternatives. Now, that could be a good thing because some people don't want to go down a very legalistic path, and and there's certainly weaknesses with thinking about Islam as primarily a legal doctrine, and that's where I argue that some of these Islamist movements, like the Muslim Brotherhood, became too legally oriented and too state oriented, and there was something about modernity and the modern nation state that made a growing number of Muslims think in terms of the state applying new legal codes. And that is not how the Islamic tradition was in pre-modernity. Law was decentralized. There was legal pluralism. The executive didn't really the executive implemented laws that weren't necessarily devised by the executive. It was devised by the jurists who had a considerable degree of autonomy and independence from the state. So the state, it's worth just bringing up the fact that I think all of these religious traditions are struggling with the fact of dominant states and states that want to domesticate religion. They see religion as a threat in some way, and religions are struggling to respond effectively. So I think that's just one thing that I would put out there. But before we get into that, I do want to raise a question which applies, I think, just to a lot of what we're talking about what are the goals of politics. I mean, so you said, James, that the goal is justice, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. In my own engagements with Matt over the past few years, my sense is that Matt is very interested in, spreading the gospel, and I hope I'm not mischaracterizing this, but converting people to Christianity is good, and that's that's a different way of approaching interactions with people than a focus on justice. So I'm just also, because that also relates to how Muslims operate politically. Like, are Muslims trying to, well, obviously in the Middle East, they're not trying to convert people to Islam because most people are already Muslim. So justice does figure much more prominently in Islamic discourse as a goal. And then the question is, can the state bring that about or not?
Yeah, and this intersects, James, with a number of things you've been talking about in terms of how Christians behave politically in America, because there's this discussion of essentially Christians need to be really nice when they're in politics so that more people will want to be Christians. So if Christians engage in political fights, that's bad for their brand, and that's bad for evangelism. And you have made a critique of that, right? You want Christians to go into politics thinking primarily about politics. Maybe you can correct me there, but so maybe you can respond to Shadi around that.
Shadi presented a dichotomy here. I also want people to know Jesus and try to share the gospel in my life quite often. But if we're going to do politics, I just want to think clearly about politics. It's like if I'm going to do accounting, I don't want to be thinking about, how many people are going to be converted through my accounting. I want to get the numbers right. I mean, right? Like what are the spheres? Sphere sovereignty, right? I mean, and so what are the pillars? The pillarization. These are all Kuyperian concepts. And so how do you do it well? And but also, I think one of the reasons I've said that the winsome frame for politics is misguided is it confuses politics, which I've already discussed that. But the other one is I think it's a little bit too certain about what will ultimately turn people off in the long run. I mean, I don't think we can augur that as well as we think we can. And we need brave reformers. So often reformers throughout church history, first of all, in Scripture, people who were prophetic of a sort, aligned with God's will. And so, again, the certainty question, for sure, we have to be careful because we don't have the same level of access to the divine as a prophet did. But then also just reformers throughout church history were often received with strong pushback. But eventually they often won out in the long run. But if they buckled quickly because they were, if John Knox, for instance, buckled quickly because people thought he was a little bit too anti-winsome, you wouldn't have the reform in Scotland. And I'm a PCA pastor, and we wouldn't have the PCA. So we can't be too certain about actually how I think people will long run respond. For instance, like, I just don't. I think the transition issue, the trans issue, a transgender issue. I think it'd be interesting in the long run, like where detransitioners return. And I think we're seeing a lot of detransitioners share their stories. And there's a really great article in the Gospel Coalition about someone sharing this person who had transitioned and still didn't solve their depression. And and the person interviewing them was asking, like, what could I have done, previous to this, like to be of service to you, like. And the person who had detransitioned was like, look, just please keep saying the truth, even when it offends. Like, please keep saying it. That would have helped me, and it will help others. And so I just think, like, we just don't know in the long run what will be effective for turning people off or on to our gospel message. Like, they might look back and be like, who were the people speaking up against some of these insane things? And I want to hear that group more, right? Because they look at that picture of like the Nazi rally, and there's one person not with their hand up. Everybody thinks they would be that person. But it's a big cost to be that person. And I think, so you need to brace for the pushback. And in the long run, you might win people over because they saw courage in the moment. So,
but so on that, how can you be so certain about what is considered insane or unjust or evil from a Christian standpoint? So, there's a number of different issues that are tied to questions of gender identity, but you can also take different positions on abortion. If sin enters everything, and we did talk in our last episode about Abraham Kuyper and how sin is very central in Kuyper's imagination, and that sin means that it's not just that we can't access divine truth like the prophets did. It's that there's a weakness. There is a depravity that actually makes the gap perhaps more larger than we're willing to acknowledge. So if we fall so short, if we're broken by sin, and that sort of introduces an imperfection that we have to be constantly self-aware about, then isn't it possible that we're misjudging what is just and what is not, what is good and what is evil on a particular issue? Like, how clearly there are some Christians who have a different view on some of the trans rights issues. And maybe they don't support quote unquote gender affirming care quite to the same extent as progressives, but they're somewhere in between. Like, isn't it possible that we just don't know exactly what the right answer is on some of these contested questions, and we have to keep open the possibility that we're not getting it completely right?
Yes. I mean, that is the gambit of created existence, particularly created fallen existence. And yet I don't think that absolves us of making the argument and getting involved, and so, but leaving open the possibility that you could be wrong. But I think that's kind of the job of like a public intellectual, for instance, is putting the argument out there and seeing and continuing the conversation. But I'm always open to being corrected and being, and being wrong about things. And I think we all have to be, but I don't think that should undermine the project from the outset. So G.K. Chesterton, famous, he has a great quote about this, right? It's like, the modern world has placed humility in the wrong place, or placed modesty in the wrong place. We used to be modest about our grasp of truth, and now we're modest about the fact of truth that exists at all. And he says that's a false modesty. And so we absolutely keep open that we are seeing it from a limited perspective and open to correction, and yet get involved, get in the game, and make the argument in as much as you see it's grounded in the clear and consistent teaching of Scripture, and how it's been received and handed on through church tradition. And so if you're, getting at variance, getting to the periphery on that stuff too much, that should, relativize your commitment to this. But if you feel like you're pretty much in line with the broad stream of Christian tradition as a Christian, I think you can be pretty confident about that. So sure, there are people who might, more progressive Christians who have a different view about human embodiment and the genders, but I think that they're very much the minority report in Christian theology. It doesn't mean they're wrong, but I don't want to make a false equivalency here. It's like, well, we're equally right or wrong, and we should have the same level of confidence. We can speak with a little bit more confidence than that minority report, I think.
Yeah, so I'd love to close. Like, I'm trying to come up with those more affirming things, because I have those difficulties as well with the things that you've written here. But I think for me, the thing that I'm most grateful for is this clear recognition from you, James, that politics involves antagonism. And the fact that there are deep differences in our political life should not shock us, and should not surprise us. And so we must go into these deep differences with a clear-eyed understanding that we're actually not going to fix this through, and we're not all going to find unity. Our task is to present as best we can our grasp onto the truth and seek justice as best we can, but understand that within this present age, there are going to be real differences. And that's sort of a core value of what Shadi and I are getting after in these conversations, is that deep difference is not a problem that we are going to solve, but it is something we can explore. It's something we can contest, but it ought not sort of terrify us and cause us to either run away or try to... And so I guess my last question, and maybe I know we need to wrap up here soon, is where did that come from you, as far as a willingness to engage deep difference, and not being surprised or terrified by it? Because so often Americans, they talk about the polarization of our culture as this just shocking and surprising thing that we need to quickly fix. So within your own story, that might be an interesting way to bring a close to this. How is it that you don't respond in that way to deep difference?
I just want to warn you all, I'm not going to let James off. There's something else I want to bring up, so just a word of warning.
Okay.
A few different threads. It didn't come easily. There's a lot of if we were getting like real deep and personal backstory, there's a lot of dysfunction in my family background. You mentioned like we come from conservative Christian backgrounds. Not me in my childhood. Definitely in my adulthood as a PCA pastor, but I didn't grow up in the church and grew up with a lot of family dysfunction, and I grew up very, very poor. And so that also has influenced a lot of my views as well, but also made me, I didn't grow up seeing difference modeled well, disagreement modeled well. And I actually had a very, until recently, I think I've grown a lot in this by God's grace, had a lot of defensiveness. And so every time I would get in an argument, I would flee and run away. And I actually have gotten stiffened up quite a bit from a few different places. One, I mentioned my in-laws, again, extremely close with them. And will never, I don't think I'm ever going to convince them on anything. And yet we're going to go see them next week. I mean, I love them. And we worked through quite a bit. But the other thing is and I know someone, you keep being an agonism. Another word would be like political agonism, right? Not just antagonism, but, which is, I think I heard you guys mention William Connolly. And so I'd read one of the books that influenced me quite a bit was Kristen D. Johnston's book on pluralism.
Yes.
And she engages William Connolly quite a bit. And again, I'm a post-liberal of a sort, and so she would critique kind of a liberal naivety and sees Connolly as a constructive conversation partner in that, right? I mean, we can't just paper over our deep differences. They're real. And so I found that really helpful. But the other thing is I was a missionary. I've been a pastor and missionary for a long time. And one of the best things I did was spending a summer in Greece doing, call it campus evangelism and meeting students on campus. And one of my favorite things, I went there, and you'll love this, I think, is I went there in, I guess, 2008, summer of 2008. And so in the middle of the election, and Obama was about to become president. And but it was like, at the tail end of the Bush presidency, and, the world was up. And I mean, he just destroyed the world, and the world economy's a mess. And we're in interminable wars. And students, when I was coming up to meet college students to talk about Jesus with them, they would always start like, so they often thought I was Greek because I looked kind of Greek. So often they'd start speaking to me in Greek, and I'd have to say, no, I can't speak Greek. But tell me what you think about George Bush. And I literally just met you, dude. Like, I can't, we're gonna get to the deepest hostile arguments. And then I would watch these friends that we'd made in Greece. I'd watch they would get these really strong disagreements, even with each other and then with us. And then they would end and be like, hey, let's go get beers later. And I just thought about it, what's the difference here? In America, we hold our ideas so close to identity. And I do think there's kind of an American Gnosticism there. I mean, and Carl Truman, similar arguments. Our ideas are who we are, or our desires are who we are. And therefore you can't touch this. And if you touch it and we disagree, you've inflicted violence upon me. And I think we all should probably, that's why the mockery thing maybe actually could be helpful. We all should probably loosen up a little bit. And my Greek friends helped me with that. So maybe I'll leave it there. And then Shadi wants to press me more.
I'm not going to lie. I love that.
I knew you would.
That is just that's Shadi bait right there. And that's, sometimes I knew that we could do it with you, James, because, I think all of us, perhaps more me and you, are happy warriors when it comes to, being in contentious debates and not taking things personally. I do worry, though, with most people that once you start introducing too much spiciness or disagreement, that there is even if they don't show it, you can almost sense them closing up. And Matt likes to mention a passage from William Connolly about the hunching up of one's shoulders when you feel threatened by an idea that you disagree with. And I think all of us have to find ways to get over that, transcend that. And I love this idea that Americans, we can't separate between individuals and their ideas, where clearly your Greek friends are able to do that. So it's partly it's cultural. I mean, I love America and I love some Americans, but but clearly, we have a cultural context that sometimes makes it harder for us to let go of things. Also, I think we're a nation of believers. We believe in the American idea. So we're not just debating issues. We're debating Americanism, where no one's really debating what it means to be Greek. That's not so that's great about America, that we have something that transcends ethnicity and origin. But there's also a danger in that we're introducing everything is ideological because everyone is debating what America actually is. Mm-hmm. And I was going to ask you a question because you have mentioned post-liberalism several times, and I have as well. And I would have been curious to sketch out what the post-liberal future actually looks like. But obviously we're not going to get into all that. Yeah. I do hope we get a chance to talk about that in more detail in a different context, because I think you are one of the most interesting theoreticians and theologians when it comes to thinking seriously about the post-liberal future. Because when I challenge people on this, they oftentimes struggle. This is always the issue. It is very easy to criticize the way things are. We know that something is wrong with the current format. What liberalism has become, more and more people are realizing that something has cracked. But then you talk about the alternatives and then you sort of hit a wall. I mean, sometimes, the answer I hear is that the alternative, Sabbath laws, like that's not enough for like the post-liberal imagination. Like there's got to be
ground
more.
zero. Yeah, it's the starting point. Yeah.
Yeah, the starting point. Exactly.
Yeah, I would say like one, I can't sketch it out. And I'm, I mean, I'm not like one of the main persons who's like very much articulating a robust vision of a post-liberal future, but I am involved. I've been involved in this conversation for over a decade. I mean, so I'm conversing with the literature and I gravitate towards a lot of it. But I would say like a main question that animates, maybe you'll relate to this, Shadi, and it could inspire a future conversation. A main question that animates a lot of my research that I haven't come up with an answer for that I'm satisfied with yet is it possible to support like liberal structures and institutions and structural arrangements without subscribing to a liberal anthropology? That's a main question I'm often thinking, and I'm wanting to wrestle that out. Maybe you could help me. I want to say yes, but it seems complicated because I don't want to give up like constitutionalism, rule of law, even some version of separation of powers and things like that. Like those types of things, like I still want to subscribe to and endorse, but I worry that they do kind of feed upon and perpetuate a liberal anthropology, and I'm not convinced on that.
Okay. I also love what you just said because that is something worth exploring and interrogating. I mean, are liberal institutions possible without a liberal anthropology? I think the jury is still out. I guess we'll have to find out. And on that note, let me just say thank you so much, James. This was great.
Thanks for having me.
And for you to be our first guest, it's an honor that you graced us with your presence. And this was great. Really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thanks, Philip.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, James. And thanks to all of you for listening to Zealots at the Gate. If you've liked what you've heard, check out the podcast Intellectual Seedbed at comment.org. You'll find fascinating articles from both Shadi and James, and some mediocre ones from me. We want to hear from you. Connect with us over at Twitter at Shadi Hamid and at Matthew Kamink, or you can write to us, zealots at comment.org, and you can expect a cheerful, sincere exchange with winsome notes from Matthew Kamink. Our thanks as well to our sponsor, Fuller Seminary's Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life. Zealots at the Gate is hosted by Comment Magazine, produced by Ali Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy, and editorial direction by Ann Snyder. I'm Matthew Kamink, and with me here is
Shadi Hamid. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Bye.